incredible thing. The transfiguration of Jesus. And actually, they didn't just see it. Because this happened years before it was written down. The Gospel of Matthew was written somewhere around the year 80, which means that this wasn't written down for at least 50 years or so after it happened. And that's a long time to remember the details of any story. Now, it is likely that they started telling this story long before that year 80. They were instructed to keep it to themselves, but only until Jesus was resurrected, and then they were allowed to tell. So I'm imagining the first people that they probably would have told would have been the other disciples. Did you remember that there were only 3 disciples up there to see it? The rest weren't there. And so that's been a curious thing over the years. Why were there only 3 disciples up there? Why weren't the rest there? Why only 3? Well, there's a lot of speculation about this. And it has been suggested that not everyone is worthy of seeing the true divine form of Jesus, that only those closest to Jesus could handle seeing that. It's also been suggested that Jesus favored these 3 disciples. They were his favorites, and he wanted to share this experience with them only. And I think that either or both of these might be true, but I also believe that there were 3 people there for a very specific reason, and that is because they were there to witness it. And 3 people was the number of witnesses you needed to prove a case in court at that time. So you needed 3. And this story is really incredible, right? You probably didn't need to prove anything in court, but it's really incredible. So he wanted people to be able to believe it and have it be trustworthy. And so eyewitnesses are the best way for that to happen. Because people would question, you were on the mountain with Jesus? And he changed from normal to brilliant? Really? And then Moses and Elijah showed up. Wait, how did you know it was Moses and Elijah? You just did? Really? How? Okay, I'm not going to question anymore. But then you said what? Did they want statues made to commemorate this? Statues? Really? Come on, man. And then God spoke. And you fell to the ground, and when you got up, it was just normal Jesus again? Like I said, it's hard to believe, so it's a good thing that there were 3 of them to back each other up. But there are some troubling parts to this encounter. The first thing that troubled me was that seeing a glowing Jesus didn't freak them out. This was a normal, everyday activity. Oh yeah, Jesus is glowing again, right? It didn't freak them out. It happens all the time. I would have been freaked out at this. But then Moses and Elijah show up, and not only that, they know who it is. And that didn't freak them out, really? Neither the fact that Moses and Elijah, who were dead for centuries, didn't freak them out, nor the fact that they knew that it was them didn't freak them out. That would have been enough for me to skid out. Now, whether they reacted to either of those is completely overshadowed by the voice of God. That was the moment that they fell to the ground, freaked out. So in the retelling of the story, of the change in Jesus, the presence of these big dogs of the faith, those are just facts in comparison to God showing up. So one of the things that we're supposed to do when we read stories like this is ask ourselves, what would we do if we were there? What would you do? Would you keep it quiet? Would you ignore Jesus? And would you tell everybody who would listen right away? How do you think other people would respond to your incredible story? Well, you have witnesses, right? You have people who can back you up. But would they? Remember, they were told to be quiet. Would they just not say anything until later like they were told to do? So what if you were out there on your own? Would you tell people? All right, let's take this out of the hypothetical. Like, what would you do if God spoke to you now? Would you believe it? Would you tell anybody? Like, what if it happened right in this moment? Would you stand up right here and say, God is speaking to me right now and wants me to tell you something? Listen to what God has to say. Would you do that? See, I'm not sure I would, and it's my job to speak for God, right? I'm not sure that I would do that. I'm not sure I would admit that I could hear God speaking right at this moment, and this is what God wanted you to hear, because it really annoys me when people say that. Like, I heard a word from God, and this is what you're supposed to do. When I hear a sentence start with, God told me, I'm only listening then for what's important to you, right? Not what really is coming from God, because that's usually how people try to lend credibility to what they have to say. And yet, I believe that God speaks to us. I do. I believe that that happens. God speaks to us all the time. But I don't think that we're always able to hear it. God's voice comes more often in a whisper than in a booming voice from the sky. And so if it comes so quietly, then how can we hear it? Well, we have to be listening. And how often do we do that? The disciples were on a mountain when they heard God's voice. And that probably had something to do with it. I mean, it's usually easier to hear God on mountains. Mountains are thin places. Now, thin places are where the divide between our reality and God's are smaller, they're thinner. And mountains tend to be very, very thin. Something about the majesty of them makes us hyper aware of God. We're more open there. We're more apt to listen. But there are other places like this too, right? Places of great beauty and nature, the Grand Canyon, the oceans. Places where you expect that you will be finding the majesty of God. But also places where you're looking for God, like camp and weekend retreats and mission trips. These things orient us toward God in such a way that it is easier to hear God and to pick up on what God is saying to us. When we are in those thin places, we're more likely to believe that it is God speaking to us and that we are listening and hearing what God wants us to hear. But then what do you do with this experience? Because who's going to believe you? So do you keep it to yourself? Or are you the type to share it with other people? And if you are going to share it with other people, do you start off with just a couple of trusted friends to see if they think you're nuts? Or do you just go up to random strangers on the square? Or post it on Facebook and see what kind of reaction you get? Where is it safe to start? To test the waters? Personally, I would want to get some confirmation from some people, some trusted people, that yeah, this does sound like God, before I started giving it to a more widespread audience. The thing is, when we have an encounter like that, it is for a reason. The disciples had this encounter, but it wasn't for themselves. It was for us. It was for the world. It was to show us that Jesus was divine as well as human, and that God still breaks into the world. And when we have an encounter like this, it isn't for us either. I mean, it's not only for us. It's for the world. And it's to tell others that God still speaks and that God speaks to regular people. And so the lesson for us on this Transfiguration Day is to remember to listen. We need to expect divine encounters. And we need to expect that divine encounters will happen in other folks. We need to expect to hear God's voice. And even if we think that we shouldn't speak for God, I'm not sure that God feels that way, really. I think that God wants us to speak because people will be less freaked out when it's our voice that they hear. God isn't going to let us off the hook if God wants us to share. We will be compelled to share this encounter with others. It isn't only for us, it's for the world. So when, and yes, I mean when, this happens to you, remember, do not be afraid. Do not be freaked out. Because when God shows up, it's time for us to pay attention. And then it's time for us to share. Would you pray with me, please? God, we give you thanks for sharing with us in your own voice. Whether that comes in a loud booming voice on a mountaintop or a whisper in our quiet time. Help us to pay attention, to be expectant, to listen carefully, and then have the boldness to share it. In your name we pray.